Bueno, pues buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today.
As a moderator, and this afternoon in this session we are going to discuss about what are the challenges to media pluralism in Europe and in Spain, trying to focus a little bit also on political independence or independence of economic and political powers. So, are media plural? Are media free to be plural? Are all types of media allowed to exist equally? Are media free of interference of political or economic powers? And if not, what can we do about it? So those are the questions we are going to discuss about and to try also to make some proposals for recommendations at the end. So I'm happy to introduce the panel today. So we have here with us today Mar Díaz Varela. She's the Director of Communications for the Spanish National Commission of Markets and Competition, la Comisión Nacional de los Mercados y Competencia. She's the Director of Communications since 2013. Until then, she was actually a journalist, and she was working for La Vanguardia. Well, sorry, she's still a journalist. That's something that you keep forever? That's a question, yeah. So we are all here a journalist in some way. So here on my side, I have Arsenio Escolar. He's a well-known journalist in Spain. He has been a manager in various Spanish media. And he founded the paper 20 Minutos that he ran for 17 years until last September. 18 years until last September. And he's here today in his capacity as the president of the Spanish Association of Periodical Publications, la Asociación Española de Publicaciones Periódicas. On my right side, I have Ivo Prokopiev. He's co-owner of Economedia Publishing Group, one of the largest publishing groups in Bulgaria, and the largest business media company in the country. Since 2013, Ivo has been, or even before, we will know a little bit more about it, he has been struggling with a campaign against his media and himself personally, and he will tell us more during the conversation today. And at the end of the panel, we have Ricardo Gutierrez. He is the Secretary General of the European Federation of Journalists, representing over, I think, 300,000 journalists in 44 countries, which is, well, it's such a number, I have to say. And under this capacity, he has been monitoring media freedom, training journalists around Europe. He also worked as a journalist, and he's teaching at the university. And myself, I'm Silvia Chocarro. I will be moderating the panel. I'm Global Advocacy Strategist for IFEX. It's an international network of NGOs working to promote freedom of expression. We are 120 NGOs in 65 countries promoting free speech. I was also a journalist in the past. And actually, interestingly enough, believe it or not, my last day as a journalist was the inauguration day of Donald Trump as President of the United States. And I was the US correspondent for Radio France International. And I cannot say that it's his fault. I didn't quit journalism because of him, but I had taken that decision that was going to be my last day, and then I was going actually to work to defend journalism instead of being a journalist myself. So we are going to start the panel this afternoon and with one question for all of the panelists. So I'm going I have asked all of them to come here with their view on what are the main challenges today for media pluralism in Europe and in Spain. So I'm going to start with Ricardo.
Thank you, Silvia. Well, from my point of view, the main challenge for media pluralism in Europe is the precariousness of the profession. We all know in this room, I think, the impact of free access to information via the internet, collapse of advertising revenues for media outlets, strong decline of sales, and the consequence is many newsrooms are empty. Today, editorial content is supplied by an army of bogus freelancers. Some figures. Globally, in Europe, 1/3 of journalists are freelancers. In Spain, since 2008, over 12,000 journalists lose their job. Today, in Spain, 1/3 of active journalists earn less than 1,500 euros per month. So that's the situation. Less journalists providing much more pieces of news. Indeed, we never faced such an intensification of work with a negative impact on the quality of information, of news, but also a negative impact on welfare at work, on health. Academic research carried out in Flanders, Belgium, showed that 1 in 5 journalists had a high risk of burnout. So today journalists are beginning to question the role and the sense of their profession. And that's, in my view, the main challenge, the lack of internal pluralism within the newsrooms. Less journalists doing the job in an increasingly precarious working condition. The second challenge, and I will show you a picture if it's possible. I need the remote control. No, okay. Next one, please. You know that guy. I'm a trade unionist. This guy is a billionaire. George Soros. I agree with him. He said a few days ago in Davos, in the World Economic Forum in Davos, that Facebook and Google are threatening democracy, pluralism, and the freedom of mind. Indeed, Facebook and Google have the power today to shape people's attention. These companies influence how people think and behave without them being aware of it. These companies are manipulating people's attention in their own commercial interest. They engineer addiction to the services they provide, including access to information. And this power, nowadays, is concentrated in the hand of a very few worldwide companies. These powerful companies are not just distributing news, information. They are doing so in a near monopolistic way, which makes them public utilities. And that particular status of public utilities should subject them to regulation and taxation. We need to preserve journalism. We need to preserve pluralism, open access to information. We need to impose full transparency on the way algorithms are shaping the news on social media. So I agree with Soros. It's high time to regulate these monopolies. Regulatory authorities must protect society against them. That's, for me, the main challenges of media pluralism in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Just to say that the two panelists on this side are speaking in English. The two panelists in this side are going to be speaking in Spanish. And after each one is going to present their challenges, I have told them that they can actually interact, so they don't have to wait for me to ask a question if you have something to say about what others are saying. So, Ivo, if you can tell us what are the main challenges for media pluralism from your point of view?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I will start where Ricardo has finished. I think the main challenge, the challenge of all challenges for media, and it's not something new, it has been a problem in the last 10 years, but now it has become very visible, is that the business model of traditional media organization is broken, and is broken for good. It will never be repaired. Just a few numbers from me as well in these lines. So according to the data from Interactive Advertising Bureau, which was just published by the recent report of Reuters Institute and Oxford University, for 2016, from total digital advertising spending, the share of Google is 49%, the share of Facebook is 40%. This is 2016. I bet that in 2017, the share will be well above 90%. And this is 90% from display advertising spending. So here, all other giants like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, Yahoo, Twitter are not included. This morning I checked the market capitalization of Google and Facebook. It is together, it is $1,240 billion US dollars, which huge number, well, significantly more than probably the total market capitalization of all global media together, probably a couple of times. It's difficult to calculate that, but for sure many, many times more. This number shows also that the markets already know what we are discussing today. There is a global monopoly. Google and Facebook have converted themselves into global utilities, which for many consumers of information are the main source of news, the main source of media. I don't think that the regulation itself will resolve the issue. It is true that there is new piece of regulation for personal data protection and for copyright protection, which is coming from the European Union, which will probably limit to an extent their business model and will allow other big players to compete more successfully with them. But that's not going to be the end of the story and the end solution for traditional media. The traditional media shall just to reinvent its own business model in a new way. Where is the main threat coming from? You know that in traditional business model there are two key relationships. One with the advertising community and one with the readers, with the users of the information. Google and Facebook and the other digital giants are key intermediary in both. They are there because they have developed in the last 10-15 years much more superior technology than the traditional publishers did, and they are able at the moment to serve better the needs of the readers and the needs of the advertisers, and because of their huge scale, this is at the fraction of the cost that any of the European publishers is able to serve those same needs. I'm not telling you something new, but I want to stress it and underline it. The old business model is done, and it is impossible to be repaired with the traditional means that we could have in mind. So the new business models are needed. This is the main element of the financial weakness in global media, but in smaller economies, in media that operates in smaller languages, like the country from which I'm coming from, Bulgaria. The total number of people that speak Bulgarian language in the world is 8 million. So whatever we do, we are in a very small marketplace. The hit from the digital disruption and digital transformation was stronger and deeper, and unfortunately, apart with the technological improvement, it coincided with the crisis of 2007 to 2008, the business cycle crisis, which accelerated the consequences of the business model crisis and basically meant the end of the traditional media business as we know it. All of the international publishing groups and international media players left the market. They saw what's coming and they sold to local interests, And in an environment where the doing media business for profit, for doing it sustainable way is not is not possible anymore, then new kind of players that are willing to trade with the influence and with the importance of media arrived on the scene. And that is how the very large part of Bulgarian media space in this example was captured, controlled by different allied political interests. It's not only one oligarch or two oligarchs or one politicians. It's a system that is established to control media. And this is more dangerous form of concentration because the concentration from anti-monopoly point of view could damage the diversity, but if the business potential is there, so there will be market-based players fighting for their existence. In the case of peripheral countries in Eastern Europe, here I don't speak only for Bulgaria. What I speak for Bulgaria applies also to very big extent to Hungary, Poland, Romania, Greece, probably very soon to Czech Republic. So it's a broader phenomenon. Because of its financial weakness, the media become very easy target for politicians to be captured and put under control. And the concentration in control is the dangerous thing because it is what produces not only fake news, but it is what threatens the overall democratic cycle of the countries, normal functioning of elections, a functioning of the opposition parties, and the core values that we all as Europeans have subscribed for in the European treaties.
Thank you, Ivan. I think actually you are going to explain to us a little bit more later about
I'll do.
I mean, not now, but I mean afterwards, a little bit about how this, your own experience in Bulgaria, about this media capture. But we can
just to conclude, I mean, this is the
we can talk about it later.
Sure, yeah.
And then I want to hear first the two panelists, and then we can move there. So, Arsenio,
Gracias, Silvia.
Thank you very much, Silvia. I'd like to subscribe everything that's been said by the two previous speakers, both Ivo and Ricardo, because this is something that's been happening in a profession. And let me give you some background. And I'm here as the president of an association of periodical publishers and the owners of media, but I'm also here as a journalist myself, an active journalist for over 40 years. The association that I chair is rather peculiar. We've got 140 companies with over 1,000 different titles that we would call probably small and medium-sized publishers in the Spanish market. The large publishing companies are not included. But the ones who are there are the ones who are most innovative, the new publishers that have just come out onto the market, usually through online media. The main digital channels, or the Spanish digital natives, are all members of the association that I preside. And those of you who are familiar with the Spanish situation will know that the journalists are the publishers. Many of them are the owners. Many of the new digital media, the Spanish native digital models, the journalists are also the editor-in-chief. It's both a journalist and a publisher. So that represents a new context, a new scenario, and we have to check to see what's happening and what's not happening. Silvia also referred to the challenges that we have to face. Well, part of the cheapening of the profession that Ricardo was mentioning earlier, especially in the case of the precarious nature of journalism and the problems that Ivo was mentioning about the world of news distribution. in the hands of the large multinational technologies. That is the big problem that the small companies face. Because of the impact of technology, of globalization and the economic crisis, we're creating a new, different habitat is being created, one that is completely different from what we were familiar with 8 or 10 years ago. And what's been happening in this territory of investigative journalism is the problems of adaptation of journalists to this new habitat. There are new species, very powerful species, the technological companies, that didn't exist before. If I had to give this prologue before, if I had to point to the key ideas of what our main concerns were going to be, and our discussion and decisions would involve around in the years ahead, I would mention these. Transparency. Transparency in the world of data and information, then journalism-related companies will probably be the least transparent companies in any sector of the economy. That's to say, transparency in terms of media ownership, in terms of the debt of those companies, transparency with respect to the business model of the media. Where are they getting their revenue from? Where are their expenses going? And not just their overheads, but how much of it is coming from their readers, how much of it is coming from the advertisers, how much of it is coming from that new and perhaps dangerous world, but certainly a worrisome world that we're talking about, editorial contents, the marketing of corporate and institutional messages. That's being mixed improperly with journalism. They're not the same thing. They're both communication, but all communication is journalism, and readers are entitled to know the difference. So transparency on the one hand, Silvia, and on the other hand, free competition. That's one of the things that we are encountering in this new habitat. The old dominant species are trying to circle the wagons and stop anyone else from getting in. And if there's time later, I'll go into this in greater detail. The third point is the reputation. I'm not familiar with the situation in the rest of Europe, but in Spain we have a very serious social problem with regard to the reputation of the journalists and of the publishers as a result of the sins committed in the past. And it's our own fault. Thank you very much, Arsenio. You've reminded me of a survey from the CIS. Those of you who are not from Spain, it's a regular publication from the Survey Institute. I think it's from 2013 or so. They asked people what they would like their what degrees they would like their children to study for, what professions they would like their children to go into, and journalism was way down the list, the second from the bottom, I think it was. But you've mentioned some of the challenges, but now let's hear what Mar has to tell us. Well, with this terribly negative panorama that you've all drawn, I think I have to speak on behalf of the Spanish regulators. The Spanish regulator is a very young institution. It was created in 2013. It's a very powerful body. It's a merging of 8 other committees and taking over the competences that nobody wanted. On the one hand, the competency of regulations in the audiovisual sector, forgive me, for the oversight of the audiovisual sector, it's assumed by the CNMC. So let me show you some figures, share with you some figures that I think are important. There are 8 people in the CNMC in this area. Until the CNMC was working, the penalties imposed on communication channels was not published. And the CNMC is a startup. We like to define ourselves as a startup, and we're doing something that's working towards transparency. Article 37 of our statute requires us to publish everything. So that's a very important aspect of our work. But I also want to remind you that we also have the functions of competition. The last C in our name is competition. So we have to oversee the competition of all companies in Spanish economy. So what's the panorama? Apart from what you have all said, and that I share, of course, according to the University of Seville, the most comprehensive study so far, 2,963 communication, active audiovisual channels are in place at the moment. There's another study by Wellcome. I think it's 500 influencers that are dominating the sporting news in Spain. So, in this panorama, what has the regulator done? Since the regulator is not just publishing the penalties imposed on the audiovisual media channels for different reasons, but it's also taken 3 decisions which I feel are very important in favour of media plurality. The first is the decision it took with regard to Telefónica and its merger, DTS. So 43 conditions were imposed, but one of them was crucial. There had to be a reserve set up for access to the internet for Telefónica's competitors. That's a key issue that my fellow journalist didn't highlight very much. And the second aspect is that the CNMC also regulated the opening up of fibre. And you might ask, how important is that? But that's what's allowed a lot more people, a lot more operators to the service, and it's reduced the cost, which is essential to greater plurality through access to the media, through access to fibre. And as we mentioned earlier, before we started this conversation, when the CNMC opposed the government's proposal for a new Google tax, in many cases the political decisions are taken on the wrong basis. And so we have got a duopoly in Spain for television. But why? Why? Because during the socialist government, the Prime Minister Zapatero, there was a decision driven by the owners of those TV channels who agreed to establish a duopoly, and they took advertising out of the public monopoly. That's the panorama we're working. But then we've also got the other aspect of the Google tax. The other media have discovered how painful that was, and they've stepped aside from that agreement. So what we have at the moment is a tremendous dispersion of media outlets. And as Arsenio mentioned, all of them are extremely weak. So, in my opinion, the main challenge that plurality has is not the plurality of media outlets, because I think there's tremendous dispersion in that regard, but the challenge is to get people to pay for information, because that's the only way that we can have strong media again. Economically robust media that are truly independent. Of course, no one more than the CMC can say that the most important thing at the moment is to increase and recover the credibility of professional journalists. Just the day before yesterday, I was mentioning to my colleague Mercedes, who's with me today, I saw The Post, a film. My husband's a journalist too, and both of us were crying at this because we lived through that battle to publish the news. And I could see in that film, that's not something that I see. That determination to publish is not something I see in my journalists. And I can tell you some anecdotes of my career as a journalist in other locations. So with the permission of the chairperson, I want to ask questions. Will the plurality of media outlets guarantee the plurality of the information? Because I have tremendous doubts about that from an objective perspective. I think the economic strength of the media outlets so that they can find a way of making money again. Because what has come crashing down is the advertising-based business model. That no longer exists. We have to find a new solution, but I don't know what that solution is. In this confusion, we've got to back the new regulator, this young CNMC institution, and like any young body, it may make mistakes and get things wrong, but it's being created as a startup. So I'll give you two examples before giving the floor back to the chair. We've got the first register of lobbies that was set up in place by the CNMC, the stakeholders register. And we feel that the only way that's possible to guarantee fair play and the same ground rules for all is through transparency. And this is something that should be looked at by the communication media themselves, because the only aspect that didn't survive the review of the companies listed in the Spanish IBEX index was the refusal of the IBEX companies to release information about their investments in communications media outlets. And there was a consensus about all the members of the committee that set up our ethical code for securities market. They all agreed to eliminate that point from the ethical code. And I think that's a very serious matter.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for helping me in, in the job of moderating, and actually I'm going to take your question. And I'm going to ask to this side of the panel, Ivo, for example, do you agree with this statement from Mar that do media plurality, which I mean, I guess you are talking about quantity, right? I mean, do media plurality in the sense of do a lot of number of media guarantee or ensure plurality of information or not?
It's a precondition to have a diversity of opinion and diversity of expression. Automatically, there is no guarantee, of course, because there are many ways to put even bigger number of media companies under dependencies, not through direct ownership, because it's going to be very visible, but it's very easy to create dependencies in a difficult and regulated environment through financing, through different institutional threats. I mean, the instrumentarium is very diverse and very efficient. We see the extreme examples how the governments control a big number of media companies in Turkey and in Russia. I mean, it's possible to be done. The key question for me is the resistance of the society. Is the society ready to address the issue? I see the challenge of today's event in this. Are we ready to understand how far we have been into this negative direction and how challenged are some of the very core values of the European Union: freedom of expression, rule of law, a right of free initiative, property rights, this kind of stuff? Because where this media control is leading, it is leading to censorship, and censorship is leading to mild dictatorship, to captured state. Some of the Eastern European countries are at the moment described as a captured states. And this is very bad diagnosis for a country which is a member of the European Union. But again, independent media could be only the one which is financially sustainable. So the core of the issue is what kind of ideas we are able to generate for restoring at least the existence minimum of the diversity of information. And I have some ideas how this to be done, but generally speaking, we have to split the problem into two. First is, if we consider diversity of opinion as a public good, there must be public funding for it. Not funding for the publishers, not funding for the NGO sector, funding for the journalists on the ground that guarantee there will be certain critical minimum of reporting, of in-depth analysis and of investigation. This is the core. And in the current environment, that cannot be sustained, that cannot be ensured through traditional publishers and media owners means. It has to be somehow ensured by the society, the same way society funds health, education, nature, minority groups. I mean, we have to put the media crisis in the safety net of the European funding and of the societies of the countries members, because otherwise we are going in a direction in which, as a result, the independent media will lose its critical importance. There is a rule of thumb which says that if the free part of media is less than 25–30%, so if the total reach of independent media is less than that, then there is no political cost for the political establishment, for the political elite. If they do something wrong, they don't pay political price. So we are that close to that number.
Mm-hmm. Arsenio, I'm waiting for you to, because he's listening to the translation. That's why I'm waiting a few seconds. So you actually founded a media yourself. So do you agree with this idea that maybe to have a lot of media do not necessarily means that we have plurality of information? From your own experience, how have you addressed that, or what's your view? Your experience as a journalist, but also as a founder of a media yourself.
The more the number of media, the outlets, the better in terms of informative. But I would qualify that statement. It's the larger the number of economically sustainable media outlets, and preferably transparent outlets, in the sense that we should be aware exactly of what they are, where their revenues are coming from, and where they are spending it. That's what I said before. It's not just a matter of how much they bring in general in terms of advertising, but what kind of advertising is feeding into their funds. Many years ago, in a discussion such as this, 3 or 4 years ago, on a controversial issue, which is institutional advertising, the publicity by public institutions, which moves a lot of money in Spain. In 2007, just to give you an idea, the central state, the national government, and the public companies run by the central government spent 369 million euros in institutional advertising. You have to add on that what the regional governments were spending. That's, nobody is admitting to what that figure might be. And the large city councils of the large cities, the small cities, the regional councils, the provincial councils, the state bodies, the regional bodies, the local bodies. This is a huge bag of money that is public money, but ends up in the communications industry, but nobody knows where it goes. No way, nobody has been capable of finding out, of tracking that money. A few years ago, when the People's Party enacted its transparency law, as president of the EPP, I went to see all the different groups and associations of journalists in Spain. I spoke to everyone in the sector, and I proposed to them, to the regulators and the legislators, the lawmakers at the time, that the public money that went to the media through institutional advertising or other kinds of mechanisms, including massive purchases of old newspapers, the press by the ministries, and the licenses for radio, television, which are a little more transparent than they were. But going back to my subject, I proposed to the parliamentary groups that all public funding that ended up in media groups should be transparent, absolutely transparent down to the last cent. You should have public or regular publication every year or however often they wanted, how much public money had ended up in which media outlets and for which reasons. And the support I got was absolutely zero, including from the press associations. I'd like to add something to that. When the People's Party did something as debatable or something as the CORA law, that grouped together the different departments, the Secretary of State for Communications asked for assistance from the European Commission for doing it, because when it came to setting out the technical qualifications for these public competitions, there was so much corruption involved that it was absolutely unheard of. I don't know. It was our commission had to participate. So we were asked to help them to define those specifications to make sure that they were in the line that you made. Now, I know that there's been a reform in that sense, but we're still in the same situation today. We don't know how much public money is ending up in the media outlets and for what reasons. And I mentioned it not just for the public associations and organizations to be obliged to do it, but for the companies to express it once a year or whenever they wanted, but voluntarily to issue the X amount of my income comes from this ministry, and Y % comes from that regional government, and such amount comes from that city council.
I was reading a little bit more when you started to work for the Spanish regulator body, and if I well remember, you mentioned several times the issue of transparency. So I'm interested to know from your experience of a regulator how you actually are addressing this lack of transparency, or what can be done from the regulator body for actually promoting transparency.
Bueno, antes de nada quería decir otra cosa.
Well, first of all, in response to what's being said, it's not just the state that has to do it. That's not where the key to this problem lies. The key to the problem lies on the other side of the fence. For instance, I don't mind how much the Ministry of Public Works is spending. The key is that one of its regulated companies has an advertising budget that's in excess of 30 million euros, and my commission has a budget of 65 million. So we can all say here that there was a communication director, Anna Castells, who was kicked out when she tried to apply objective criterion for the advertising budget under President Mercedes Sala many years ago now, I agree. But she was dismissed after publishing this proposal for an objective system for contracting advertising. So it's not just a matter of controlling the ministry, but also the companies controlled by the ministries. And what I forgot to mention in my opening presentation, and I apologize for that, is that since the CNMC was created, we've had an analysis of how plurality of information is improved in the public broadcasting services. And we have an examination of that. And that, in the case of the UK, Holland and Sweden, they don't do that. It's only done in France, Portugal, Andalusia and Catalonia. That's very interesting that they have the audiovisual control bodies in place. And I have to acknowledge, and Mercedes can add more to this point, that we've created in the CNMC a whistleblower program to protect our technicians on the initial report. Compared to what was published at the end of the day, the council has now become much more plural in the CNMC, so the second report that come out will be much more valiant. I was crying over the press release that had to be done. I might cry over a film I watch, and I'm not a very tearful person normally, but that we have a tiger with paper teeth in the CNMC. We don't yet have an institution that's in charge of ensuring pluralism. What we can do is strive to ensure transparency. What can we do? To begin with, we've started with our stakeholders register, to register all the lobbies so that companies can enforce their ethical code. But the problem is that it's a voluntary register. We don't have the legal force to oblige them to do so. We also have our whistleblower system to report political interference, and also we participate in discussions such as this, and we're preparing other events, but we can't do a lot more from the CNMC. The challenge is in educating the citizenry and explaining to them that it is extremely important how they decide and what pressure they bring to bear to ensure that things change.
Here in this room, I think there are various academic groups or civil society groups or unions that one of their roles is raise awareness about all of this, precisely to have a citizenship, citizens that are more aware of the relevance and the importance of independent journalism and pluralism and all of that. I wanted to turn to Ricardo because we have mentioned several times during this conversation this idea of the weaknesses of the business model and the fact that we have mentioned, we have talked also about media sustainability, media viability. As you work for the European Federation of Journalists, I am curious to know, is it possible to have actually sustainable and viable media with such precarious conditions for journalists? Or what comes first?
There are some examples of viable media. I don't think it's possible to apply the same recipe to every single media. You cannot use the methods of New York Times, which is the model everybody's raising today because it works. Okay, they managed to build a paywall. I don't think you can apply the same recipe to every single media, and particularly regional media. But what I know is that it's possible for, journalism is public good, is a public good. So it's normal that public authorities should support. And I know there are some possibilities for public authorities to support independent and quality journalism. Coming back to your question, of course, media pluralism is not about the number of active media outlets. It's about the quality and the independence of editorial content. And states public authorities have the opportunity to support it. How? By helping journalists and the sector to build self-regulation bodies, press councils, by supporting by independent funds investigative journalism. We have really good examples in Belgium, in the Netherlands, of public funds dedicated to support investigative journalism projects in an independent way, not state giving money to journalists, but through an independent jury, for example. So it's possible, and we need more than ever before that kind of support from public authorities. Maybe
just to add, and I want to give you an example. In Bulgaria, there are 500 more or less acting general interest journalists at the moment, and for them to make their work sustainable, the annual amount that is needed is approximately 20 million euro. So every year Bulgaria receives 2 to 2.5 billion euro in structural funds. This is less than 1% of the annual EU budget. So I mean, not the amount of money is the issue, obviously. There is a lot of money. I mean, Spain, I guess the number will be 10 times greater, probably 8 to 10 times greater, because the living cost here is higher and the number of journalists probably higher. But it's not about of money, it's about priorities and safety net. This is not gonna resolve the existence problem of media companies in the long term. This is just a reaction to an emergency situation in which the media is at the moment, and it is a result of a policy of doing nothing in the last 10 years in which the problem has emerged in front of our eyes. I mean, what's coming was visible 10 years ago. It's not something new, but it was not addressed by policymakers in Europe for many reasons. We can comment this as well. But we are at the moment, we are where we are. And we have to say this is an emergency situation. We have to somehow resolve it as an emergency and then start a conversation, what's next? Because it's a very legitimate conversation, and now it is a conversation between all actors for restoring the media ecosystem.
Thank you, Ivo. Well, there are so many things on the table and many, and I would love to continue this conversation for a long time, but I want to open the floor to the public that I'm sure they have questions for all of you. So I think I have actually the microphone that belongs to you. Excuse me, if you can introduce yourself before asking the question. If instead of a question it's a comment, I don't want to be impolite, but I really ask you to be very, very brief because we have very little time for questions. Thank you.
Hola. Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sergio Cebrián. I am an editor of European news site, Eurobox, that's the name of it. Box Europe, sorry. So my question is for Mar. So are you aware of any European initiative for transparency? I mean at the European level, at the institutions, at the parliament, any directives, any projects? You mean in the media industry? Yes, media transparency, okay. Well, I'm aware of an initiative. Actually, we couldn't join the initiative, unfortunately. So a paper is being produced about fake news. So this is the initiative of some media that have decided to disclose the income from advertisers. So I have like a bit of bad conscience because we consider this from an economic viewpoint, but I believe, well, perhaps doesn't sound very glamorous, but perhaps we journalists should take a look at it. And me as a communication officer now, I am finding a number of questions that make me feel ashamed. So we journalists, we are not only attracted by money, but also by the sources of information. Spain, correct me if I'm mistaken, Wall Street Journal was the only media that dared to denounce the a large IBEX company that was being pressing on the media or giving money to media outlets. So this is not a problem of companies. Of course, this takes away informative pluralism. That's a problem of the actual journalists. And I'm finishing very quickly here. So a sanction is given to a company. The only company that has been proven to have a monopoly. So it was Cellnex that was about to be listed on the stock exchange. The communication officer, good friend, colleague at Vanguardia, does a wonderful strategy and manages that the headline is blow to CNMC because sanctions are not being paid and they want to reduce the amount of these sanctions at the courts. That was on all the media. And I said, this is very severe because the ruling and the says that the government is forced to change regulations of satellites because there is a monopoly there. No media outlet has published that, and the president called the former president of CNMC and managed to publish in the leaflet for investors, first of all, that a sanction of high amounts of money had been given to Cellnex, 8 million euros, and those who bought a share of Cellnex was assuming regulatory risks, that is to say, that they could change the framework in which they would believe that they could be getting money from. Okay, this is exactly what is happening right now in Spain. And I guess, well, Ricardo would like to say something, and then we will take more questions from the room. Please be brief, okay, because we are running out of time. Well, at the European level, we have the media pluralism monitor. Well, it sheds light, it gives transparency regarding media ownership. Many ONGs, the colleague from RS, told us about media ownership. There is another NGO, very, very active in Madrid, Accessing for Europe. They also have programs regarding media ownership, transparency. But like I said, this is more a civil action, civil society action. Yeah, there is national legislation, but European level, media monitor pluralism is the most visible tool available. Thank you. I repeat. So, well, I belong to the Trade Union of Journalists in Catalonia. So, I was very interested in this roundtable because I can see again the panic that we are having to regulation. The right of communication is a human right. So there is nothing above that. So there is nothing above human rights. Everything falls below that. So there are at least 3 court rulings issued by the Human Rights International Courts stating that states should not censor but have play an active role to ensure that citizens enforce or enjoy the right to information. So therefore, states should legislate, should make legislation. It is mandatory for states to legislate for the right of information. When there is good legislation in place, things work properly, and large international organizations have followed the example of legislation carried out in these aspects in Latin America. So first and foremost, legislation. How can you take for granted transparency in the sense of corporate people, business people, in the sense of journalists, if there is no cross-sectional law embracing all that? If there is no cross-sectional law on communication about all the issues that are being discussed here today, we will continue to discuss this over and over again and without any solution. Well,
I'm so sorry because we really don't have time. How 5 minutes? Well, 5 minutes, it's like 1 or 2 questions. If you want, let's take 2 questions because in 5 minutes there is not really much more time, and then we can answer these 2 questions. So there was, honestly, there was 1 question there, but I don't remember who was first.
Sí. Bueno, yo soy Carlos del Castillo. Soy periodista del diario Público.
My name is Carlos del Castillo. I am a journalist that work at Público. I would like to touch upon an issue that has not been covered today, but it is linked to the news that are being delivered by the large media groups. It's about the fake news. Fake news, they have turned this into an issue of national security. Actually, there is a commission at the parliament dealing with that issue under the headline of national security. So do you think that this is an intentional discourse? Do you think that they have just done it to create a context so that all the news and media that are outside that fake news, they are no longer suspicious of delivering those fake news?
Panel, I don't know if you are aware that actually the European Commission has put in place a high-level panel on fake news to discuss this phenomenon and trying to think what. Yes, our work, yeah, and so Ricardo is member, so maybe Ricardo is the perfect person here to answer that question.
Voy a contestar en castellano ya que...
Okay, I'm going to answer in Spanish because the question was put in Spanish. Well, yes, I'm a member of that group, of that panel, but we haven't get down to actually work on the topic. But it is true to say that many member states, many European governments are taking advantage of the panic that has been created around fake news. And to be honest, we are doubtful as to the actual impact of the fake news. And actually, I'm afraid of it because we are not taking into account the requirements of freedom of expression when we are adopting or embracing legislation such as those being announced by Macron in France, in Italy. So where we have democratic countries that are making decisions and implementing legislations which are anti-democratic. We are more in favor of self-regulation, critical education for the media, self-regulation of advertisers, not only self-regulation of journalists and media, but also advertisers. So to me, the fight against fake news should be an integrated, comprehensive type of a struggle rather than passing on a law, leaving it to a judge to decide what is true and what it is not true without having the participation of journalists. So it's a question of professional ethics rather than of legislation. I think this is just a scandal. This is tremendous, trying to create ministries of true, and so that the administrators of that ministry are either politicians or judges. Yeah, when you want to resolve a problem, what you have to do first is diagnosis. Self-criticism is just essential. Sorry for that. So we, in this country, journalists have to be self-critical. I'm going to share another example with you. So a number of fake news were being delivered about CNBC, and I called the journalist, a senior journalist, older than me, married to a former director of a mainstream paper in Spain, and I told her, look, a fundamental rule is just to check out what you are publishing. This is rule number one in journalism. And she answered back, look, news in the new way of making journalism, you just don't check them out. What actually matters is your publishing of them. So the freedom of expression is regulated under Article number 2 of the Constitution and the General Law of Audiovisual Communication, in Article number 4 to be more specific. So journalists should be more self-critical. We should be more self-critical with ourselves. Yes, I fully agree with you, but I associated that with what Ricardo said: self-regulation, and good internal and best internal practices, without any kinds of questions. But we just don't want to be regulated by powers. We are not there for that. Arsenio, please. Well, 30 seconds to finish. I would like to give the floor to Ivo. Ivo would like to say something.
5 more minutes because the discussion is very lively. The organizers, I guess, yes. Yeah. Okay, so on the fake news, because it's really...
We just got 5 minutes more from the organizers.
One of the, thank you very much.
That doesn't mean that you can talk for 5 minutes.
No, 1 minute. My take on the fake news. I think it's related with the business model problem. Facebook is 8.5 years old company. For 47% of the global population, they are the main source of news. Not media, not journalists. Facebook is the main source of news. They were not ready, none of them, neither the technology, the compliance officers, the owners, none of them was not ready for the global role that they are actually playing in politics and in our societies. That's why they're making this big step back now, lowering media presence, because they don't know how to handle it. It's not only about the regulation of the European Union, but for them it's going to be relief as well. And again, from Eastern European experience, a response to the fake news is not more regulation, is not more legislation, because in Eastern Europe that means giving more tools, more power in the wrong hands, which will immediately be used against what has remained from free media.
Thank you, Ivo. That's a very interesting comment. So we have one question here.
Bueno,
that was waiting from the beginning.
Bueno, como nos han alargado un poquito más, yo soy Manu.
Because we have some extra time, my name is Manu Mediavilla from the Trade Union of Journalists here in Madrid. I loved this round table for the first time in years. I've been in a conference where we are hearing about self-criticism. Nearly all the members of the panel have called our attention, has asked us to look at ourselves, to be self-critical and take into account what happens in the media. And so we are in a precarious situation, so informational content quality has been reduced significantly as a result of that. So, of course, we always have to blame someone. Now we are blaming Google, Facebook, fake news, etc., etc. We are also putting the blame on the hate discourse, etc., etc. However, we should also be self-critical about other aspects. In all these aspects, in all this process, where we ended up in Facebook and Google algorithms, and what did media do? Well, made people redundant, to reduce salaries, to worsen working conditions. What did public media do? Well, they just bend it to public authorities. What did they do? What did journalists do? Well, they didn't say anything. They just resignated themselves because they just didn't want to be made redundant. What did the large trade unions did? Well, to keep the decreasing and small shares or quotas of power. So at the end of the day, we didn't ask ourselves the basic question, the key question that I would like to ask not only to the panelists but to everyone. Why don't we talk about making good journalism? If we make good journalism, perhaps people would not end up being in Google, Facebook, or algorithms, or nothing of the sort. Let's make good journalism. Let's continue to make good journalism. Let us go back to basics. Let us go back to where we started. Some of us went to faculty, others to school, others learned it by doing it, etc., etc. Let's go back to making good journalism.
We are going to end the panel. I have to say that the idea was to end the panel on a positive and proactive note, and I had asked the panelists to come here with one recommendation on how to promote and guarantee media pluralism. So I don't know if we are able to say one recommendation, each one in 10 seconds, each one. Otherwise, because the next panel is about recommendations, you can also give your recommendation during that panel. But well, the idea was to end on a for the next panel. So Can we maybe end with a positive note, each one, 10 seconds, something like a recommendation on what we can do to improve the situation that we have been describing, that sometimes maybe can be a little bit pessimistic, but...
In a few words, yes. 1 year ago, the all EU member states, EU governments co-signed the Council of Europe recommendation on the protection of journalism and the safety of journalists. It's a recommendation full of good practices in order to support quality journalism. So what I ask them is to implement that recommendation. None of them are doing so today.
I think we are fortunate that the media industry was the first one to experience digital transformation and to be completely dismantled by the digital disruption, which gives us now significant advantage compared to other industries to know what we have missed and to try to re-establish the new business model. I agree with the gentleman here that the core is re-establishing the trust of our audiences to start making excellent journalism again. And the second hope, I really think this is very optimistic, is blockchain, because blockchain as a concept, as a technology, as an opportunity for media companies to interact directly at a very minimal cost with their readers and with their advertisers is something with potential to change the rules of the game in media industry. In this sense, I agree with George Soros that the days of Google and Facebook are numbered, but not for the reasons he mentioned. I think the days are numbered because of the emergence of blockchain concept.
Bueno, me sumo a lo de buen periodismo, pero por ser un poco autocríticos.
Well, to be a bit autocritical here, Chomsky mentioned a few years ago that journalism and media were facing serious risk of becoming the arm of institutional relations of political and financial elites. I would be very happy if we wouldn't turn into that. And if on top of that we manage to make good or excellent journalism, even better. Well, we have to be self-critical, as we all said, and as Manu reminded us, we journalists have to recover our credibility, and we have to go back to the true sense of journalism, to tell the truth, checked out truth, true stories. That's what we have to tell. And second, also very important, periodicals or media companies have to go back to charging for information. I don't know how they will do it, probably through blockchain or you name it. So citizens will have to understand that they have to pay for good information somehow through advertising, but that's basic. Transparency, perhaps.
About telling the truth, covering the US elections until, last January. As you might know, in the United States, there is a new trend promoted intensively by the president, which is to call every single journalist a liar, or in every single media fake news media. So I remember in one of the rallies with Mike Pence, who is the vice president of the United States, we were all the media outlets in a place like this one, and then all the audience was there, and Mike Pence was at the end giving his speech. And so at some point, the people turned to us, we are the media, and the people start to call liars, liars, liars. So at that moment, it was, I realized too also the effect of politicians, or in this case, the President of the United States, questioning constantly, every day, whether the journalists are telling the truth or not. And so I think that's also something that we have to fight against, and we have a lot of work to do. So thank you very much for the panel, to all the panelists. It was really interesting to talk to you, and thank you for the organizers. And I hope you enjoy the panel. And now we are going to the next one about recommendations. Thank you very much.
So I allowed this session a bit more time because we calculated time for discussion anyway. The idea was to have the recommendations first and have then an open discussion. So now, as we allowed a bit more time to this discussion after this panel, I think, which was useful. It's just that later the discussion will be a bit shorter, but now I'm really happy to, so we can continue the discussion later after the recommendations and demands, and of course also during the evening reception after we finish here. So I have two speakers, Dr. Manuel Sanchez de Diego, and I want to start with Tarlach McGonagle. He is actually the main drafter of the recommendations of the Committee on Media Pluralism and Transparency of Media Ownership of the Council of Europe. And the latest draft is really like the recent draft. And Tarlach, before I tell too much, I welcome you on stage. Tarlach is a researcher at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam and a senior researcher at the Netherlands School of Human Rights Research.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. My first observation is that the easiest way to scare the organizers at a conference these days is just to introduce the term fake news. It's very attention-grabbing. It's like releasing the cat amongst the pigeons, and there's no knowing where the discussion will go afterwards. So I'll resist the temptation to get involved, and I'll get back to the title of the session at hand. Now, in the program, the title was Recommendations and Demands. I'm not sure if there's a clear cutoff point between the two. There are an awful lot of people in this room who are doing excellent campaigning work, and they would be the first to tell you that if recommendations go unheeded for long enough, they can rightfully become pressing demands. I today am going to talk to you about one particular recommendation, or at least a draft recommendation, on pluralism, media pluralism and transparency of media ownership. It's a draft recommendation that has been prepared over the course of 2 years by a committee of experts under the auspices of the Council of Europe. I was rapporteur for that drafting group. And the state of play is that this draft recommendation, one of these days, will be submitted to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe for consideration and possible adoption. I'm going to stand back and give a little bit of contextual detail in the hope that that'll be useful. What is this recommendation? Is it just, if it is adopted by the Committee of Ministers, will it just be another piece of paper in a pile, or what kind of effect will it have? Well, it's a text that isn't legally binding, but having said that, it's a text that is politically very persuasive. It is addressed to the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, and it's intended to give them guidance on how they can best promote the values of media pluralism and transparency of media ownership. So it tries to do many things. It tries to provide guidance at a level, at a general level, concerning regulation and policy, but it also looks at the detail of what that regulation and policy could involve. It also tries to look further than just formal instruments that could be adopted at the national level, and it tries to suggest other ways in which programs and practices could be enhanced in order to advance these goals. So, obviously when we're talking about media pluralism and transparency and their impact on and importance for democracy, we're dealing with huge, big issues. So let's just start with one little slide here about the types of situations that we're trying to avoid when we seek to promote media pluralism and transparency of media ownership. The first thing we're trying to avoid is what Alexander Michael John once called unregulated talkativeness. And that's just a lot of noise and a lot of nonsense, and every time I think of that, I immediately associate it with the minions. The other kind of situation that we're trying to avoid is where powerful actors in society, typically politicians, governments, states authorities, but also, as was mentioned in earlier panels, powerful commercial forces or religious forces would acquire a position of dominance and power and control over the media with negative consequences for the quality of public debate and the plurality of media and other voices in public debate. So they're the situations we're trying to avoid. But what does pluralism mean in today's internet-dominated communications landscape? Hope you can see this wonderful advertisement from The Guardian properly. What you see there is all different mice, all coming together in different ways. And the slogan reads, listening to lots of different views rather than just one means you can decide for yourself instead of just being told what to think. Don't you agree? You don't have to, of course. What this slide tries to capture is that our traditional understandings of media pluralism have to be renewed in the internet context. In the past, we would maybe look at media ownership and control of media as one of the primary ways of determining whether there were concentrations of control and dominance in the media landscape. Nowadays, it's much more complex. You've got a whole range of internet-based actors who control or at least heavily influence the flow, availability, findability, and accessibility of information and other types of content online. And they do so partly through algorithmic means. And there you've got other questions about pluralism, like the impact of all these new actors on the information that we can access and that we actually use. And you also have big questions, not just about transparency of ownership of these online actors, but also transparency about the ways in which they select, make available, recommend, etc., different types of information and content. I asked the question a moment ago if this draft recommendation, if and when adopted, whether it'll become another piece of paper in the pile or another piece of paper in the drawer. The reason for asking that is that the Council of Europe already has a number of standard-setting documents dealing with these issues, which provide valuable guidance to member states on how they should deal with these issues. The most recent one dates from 2007. It was I think, a very good document at the time, but one of its concluding notes was, wait a minute, everything's changing, we got to change accordingly, but that's the next step in the journey. Well, 10 years later, that step has become a very, very big step, and that was the challenge facing the drafting committee. In that last recommendation, the main focuses were a range of measures promoting structural pluralism of the media. In other words, what measures are there to ensure that there is a variety of media outlets available to society? The second focus was on measures promoting the diversity of content. So the point has been made several times today that pluralism in and of itself will not guarantee quality debate. I think that's a fair point, but it can have a significant influence on the chances of quality debate and quality journalism and diversity of content emerging when there is pluralism in terms of ownership of media outlets and a pluralism in the variety of media outlets. Media transparency was already then signaled as an important point, and the role of scientific research in advancing our understanding of these issues was also set out. I missed a crucial slide there. If I could just go back. Yeah, this is the basic structure of the draft recommendation. First of all, there's a preamble. The first substantive part is about a favorable environment for freedom of expression and media freedom. So just like what Ricardo mentioned at the end of the last session, when we're trying to combat fake news, when we're trying to enhance pluralism, it's very important to have an integrated approach. The point of departure is freedom of expression, but also a culture of independence for the media themselves and for the media regulatory authorities, so that these are the best circumstances in which free and pluralistic debate will emerge. And the European Court of Human Rights has stated that states have a positive obligation to guarantee pluralism in the media sector. And moreover, this pluralism should be effective in practice. So that entails taking legislative and policy measures to create a favorable environment for media pluralism. The second main focus is media pluralism and diversity of media content. Here you see the two big focuses of the previous recommendation coming back, but then transposed into the online environment. And things like the emergence of new gatekeepers, often called internet intermediaries, that's been a big game changer. And here we examine the ins and outs of the impact and modus operandi of these gatekeepers alongside more traditional approaches to media pluralism. We churn it all together and try to see how we can make sense of it and come up with well-designed policy recommendations. The next big focus is the regulation of media ownership. Now, there could have been a full stop there, but actually, if you really want to look at media ownership in meaningful ways and its impact on democracy, I think you have to go further. And that was the approach taken by the committee. Namely, that media ownership, concentrations of media ownership, that's not the beginning and the end of the story. You also have to look at models of control and significant influence, as distinct from ownership, outright ownership, and also the concentration of ownership. And one of the key criteria here is to determine when influence over media outlets reaches the point where it can have a significant impact or an influence over strategic decision-making of those media outlets or the journalistic freedom that drives those organizations. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to keep going here. Transparency of media ownership similarly could have been followed by a full stop, but that's not the whole story. It's important also to, in terms of media ownership, to look at horizontal, vertical, and cross-media ownership, and also the value chain, the vertical integration that was mentioned by Olaf earlier today, but also to look beyond pure questions of straightforward ownership, look at beneficial ownership, and also to look at transparency of organization and financing of media organizations. Again, transparency isn't an end in itself, and I think this point was made very well in an earlier panel, that there's maybe some legitimate reasons for pushback on transparency, such as trade secrets. I think it was it Mary who made that point earlier? But or data protection and privacy. But there should nevertheless be a culture of disclosure, and we try to set out different requirements that could be useful in that regard. And then finally, there's a chapter on media literacy and education, because we see media literacy increasingly as an important tool for making sense of the multimedia environment in which we find ourselves. So transparency and media literacy going together, they can be ways for the public to see where information is coming from, how it's been produced, how it's been circulated, and what its likely impact will be. And another important feature of transparency is that it serves important information purposes for the public on the one hand, but also for the regulatory authorities on the other. And then the final section, as I say, media literacy. sometimes, unfortunately, media literacy is seen as a soft policy option. It's included almost as a matter of course, but it isn't teased out. Here, in this document, efforts are made to tease it out and to spell out its relevance, not just in terms of school curricula, but also as part of lifelong learning, and also to show how questions like pluralism and transparency should really be integrated into how media literacy is taught and advanced. So I'll leave it at that, because my co-panelist here has got plenty of valuable things to say, but I'm happy to take some more questions in due course if nobody mentions fake news and distracts the whole discussion. The one thing I should say about this draft text is that it's complex, it's detailed, it's not bedtime reading. But I think it's very valuable because, like the other recommendation that Ricardo mentioned, there's an awful lot in there, and there are lots of takeouts for a whole range of different parties. And I think that despite it being directed at states parties, civil society, academics, and other stakeholders, media professionals, journalists can get a lot out of it. So I'll leave it at that. I had some discussion questions, but I'm sure you've got discussion questions too. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the organization and for you.
Thank you very much for having invited me, and thank you very much for your participation. Well, little else can be added to what my colleague has just mentioned. I'd like to make two or three things clear. I will divide my presentation in, well, first of all, I will share with you a number of reflections and then a number of recommendations. First reflection is that the approach that we have taken to date should be changed. With this, I mean that the media or the media owners or the journalists should not be the main players, the main protagonists, but citizens, the people. They should be at the core of what we do, at the core or at the heart of our attention. When journalism works properly or performs, is because it is projected to our readers. So I'm not only a journalist, but I'm also legal expert. In Spain, we have advertising law, we have several regional laws. Well, laws are okay as long as they are complied with, and if that is not the case, that generates mistrust. So powers should support pluralism, transparency, and to bother less. They can carry out this bothering through laws such as the gag law, or also through supporting competitors. So when the economic or political power intervenes and somehow shakes the market and breaks pluralism, things, democracy, some of the democracy is lost. I'd like the presentation given by Marc Cabra and others about taxation. So donations that do not pay taxes or benefit from tax rebates, and some journalists have some tax rebates because of the social function that they perform. companies, or for instance, the cinema industry has to pay lots of taxes, or lots of taxes are imposed on that. But that's not the way to go. Taxation is not the way to go. So next, I would like to separate the issue of money, ownership, who gives the private subsidy, that is to say, loans and credits, for those working in the field of journalism, or for instance, that dichotomy between the editor and the publisher. So, all in all, some measures should be taken so that media directors and journalists will have freedom even regarding the ownership of the media. Some of you would say that there is a law in Spain providing for that, but that is just minor. And now let us move on and talk about media transparency. So, transparency law was approved in 2013. This law had vacatio legis, which means this is a break that was taken by the government and 2 years of holiday taken by the public administration. And then in article number 3, it talks about other subjects, subjects that are entitled to it. So that is to say, active transparency is imposed on the public entities that will be beneficiaries of public aid in an amount higher than 100,000 euros, or when at least 40% of the annual income come from public subsidies, as long as they reach the minimum amount of 5,000 euros. This would allow those media who receive direct funding to comply with this active transparency. It is true to say that it is difficult to include at this point in time within the public subsidies the issue of institutional advertising. I think that media transparency does not only come through public subsidies, but also comes from the public role played by media. I don't know whether it is the actual company providing the media or the journalists who receive tacit delegation from the public. For instance, a patient trusts doctors to get a cure. Person trusts the electrician to have to provide electricity at home. So therefore, people trust journalists in terms of information. So in this sense, I'd like to say something important here. Media do not produce, manufacture cars or sausages, and which undergo strict quality controls, but journalists generate free public opinion, which is essential in democratic systems, and perhaps quality controls are not existing in our environment. So they have a counter power function, and they do that through 2 significant corporate elements. First of all is advocating for an ideology or just making money. Defending ideology or advocating for an ideology, we are all aware of media that have an ideology, and we are also aware of media who want to make money. At this point in time, the business is not only about a business of making money, but it's also about being an influencer. So I very much liked what we heard about Colombia and having a mogul who is the owner also of beer companies. Unfortunately, when the company outside the world of journalism goes into the world of journalism, there we get a short circuit because the informative activity is contaminated with other economic interests. So therefore, we want to promote transparency of what's public, because that will lead us, that will take us to media transparency. Politicians should be transparent in the way they interact with media. They should also be transparent in management or processing of the money that goes to media. Public institutional media should be, institutional advertising should be transparent. Well, a case was taken to court in Seville about the advertising carried out by the Metro of Seville, and at the time, so that was the first time that a case like that was taken to court. So we want to have laws, but perhaps we want to have a lower number of laws and to be fulfilled. We also want to raise our democratic awareness. Me, as a supporter of transparency, whenever I give training courses or whenever I talk to civil servants, I see a natural predisposition of civil servants to transparency. Why is that? Because there is a democratic sense, because there are people, there are those who want to do things well, and that is very important. Also very important, and something that I would like to recommend to you is the following: follow the money. So surely that will remind you of something. It's not only about the transparency of the ownership, also transparency of the subsidies, of the loans, of the credits, etc., etc., etc. And I think when it comes to setting recommendations, to making recommendations, we should all be clear that money, and especially public money, should be transparent, should be for citizens. Another recommendation interesting to follow is the following. That is to say, establishing a firewall between in ownership. Well, there is owners are responsible to choose or to hire those working in their company, and are also responsible for ensuring that the employees do a good job. That's where the involvement of the editor should finish. I know that this is very difficult to advocate for, and especially in small media, and especially in internet-based media. Another aspect that I had not given a name to it, but Manu mentioned, is making good journalism. I visited a media shorts ago that were very much concerned about the transparency of their content. What does it mean? It means that we media must be, as well as journalists, must be honest with our readers. We must say why this is my opinion, whether there are any vested interests behind that opinion. All in all, being honest about how we reached or come to that information. So why we come to specific information, we want to be transparent about that. And so always there will be also some things that will never be disclosed or might not be disclosed at all times, the secret of the sources, or that the secrecy or corporate secrecy But if we succeed in telling our readers, this is the information we came out, this is the opinion that we have, these are the sources financing us, this is the ideology of our media, surely we will be understood and we will enjoy the trust of those who share our ideology, as well as the respect of those who may be fully against our ideas. So I'm afraid I have to finish because I've been talking for 15 minutes now, and I would like to finish by saying that at the end of the day, this is about having an environment of equality and freedom. In that playing field, we do not only have media and journalists, we also have the big information managers, Google, Facebook, etc. And therefore, it is essential to foster, to enhance and promote new generation fundamental rights, right to protection of secrecy, confidentiality, and access to public information. All in all, if we manage to build this playing field of transparency, freedom, from a culture of participation, we will all be winners. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So, as I said before, we had to cut the discussion which was foreseen for now, as we allowed more time in the discussion before. But I would like to at least give the two panelists for the recommendation the chance to comment. So Tarlach, before I open the floor for just one or two questions again, would you like to add something?
Yeah, thanks. Well, one thing that has been coming up a lot throughout the day is the importance of quality journalism and the difficulty of finding financing and revenue to sustain that kind of journalism. And I think that awareness is very much present in the draft recommendation, and there's a section devoted then to support measures for the media and media pluralism that examines possible financial measures that could be taken to sustain the quality journalism that will contribute to pluralism, and also pays particular attention to how that goal could be achieved online. But one of the important points that was made just now is that when support mechanisms are devised, it's very important that they also be transparent and that there are criteria in place to make sure that they're not abused and that the necessary safeguards would be followed. And again, I think some other very, very useful points were made just now that are also present in the draft recommendation, namely that even though the recommendation is more concerned about transparency of ownership questions, there are other related questions about the transparency of content as well, and being upfront about vested interests and the provenance of different content, whether it's commercial or political. And again, that gets back to the earlier discussion. If you could just indulge me for 1 second, I think I'd just like to just read one short section about the kind of goals that the transparency objectives should have. Very short and very fast. It's a regime of transparency of media ownership that ensures the public availability and accessibility of accurate, up-to-date data concerning direct and beneficial ownership of the media, as well as other interests and influence that influence the strategic decision-making of the media in question or its editorial line. So the idea is that this kind of information would be made available in an accessible, meaningful way, and that efforts would be made to contextualize that information and explain its importance to the public.
Thank you very much. I just want to say we just shared the recommendation, the latest draft, also on our Twitter profile. So if you want to read it in detail, you find it there. And keep your questions also for the evening reception. But if you have a very urgent comment or question right now, I would be happy to take 1, maximum 2 questions. Wait, it was very shortly.
Very shortly, the main instruments in the hands of European Commission to influence member states is European funding. And there is negative correlation between media freedom and funding. So the most funded countries, Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary, are the least media free. So do you think it's a good idea to connect the rule of law and media freedom with the funding? Because that's the only way to make the governments listen.
That was to both, or addition more, yeah. So you don't want to have a comment on that? You want to comment on that?
Obviously, if we want to talk about quality journalism, then we must start with well-funded journalism. But what is fundamental to have high-quality journalists? That we have to have journalists digging for the information and looking for it in the right way. One of the crises in journalism that we've had in Spain, at least, is that newspapers or the communication media and the media outlets have simply transmitted what the press releases said from the communications officers of the companies, and many journalists in the room will agree with. Well, why did they do that? Because they had young journalists or trainee journalists with low salaries. So how can we get that extra finance for them? Well, I think what needs to be done is something has to be done through tax advantages, tax breaks. That would probably be one of the best ways in my view. Of course, the problem is that we could have crowdfunding schemes for these media outlets, but then you've got the risk of money laundering and other problems. We might also find ourselves involved with indirect interference. So this is a very thorny issue and hard to resolve. I want to recall a conference we held at our School of Journalism at the university, and we had the leading speakers in Spain on the subject, and we want finance that will allow us to grow, basically by buying out our rival. We want to buy out our rival, and why do you want to grow? To be more competitive. But competitive? If you buy out your competitor, who do you need to compete with? And we have to think about the anti-monopoly legislation. And I think Mar here, Mark Cowder representing the CNMC, has an important role to play in that regard.
And we continue with our farewell already. And if you have further questions, as said, they can be taken later.
I don't know if may I ask my question in Spanish and ask you to translate specifically for Mrs. Tarlach. Okay. So, en la anterior legislatura, en la presente
in the current sessions of Parliament, one of the parliamentary forces included a private member's bill to introduce limits for cross-ownership of media in Spain. There's no limit in Spain compared to Germany or the United Kingdom. There's no limit here to cross-ownership in Spain. And the response of the political parties, particularly from the main newspapers such as El País and El Mundo, was very forceful. There was manipulatory editorials on the front page, and they said that this proposal was to control the ownership of the media, and without referring to cross ownership, and without indicating these are very common in other countries in our European environment. So isn't it sometimes the media themselves who are the main barrier for preventing pluralism, for introducing measures to encourage pluralism? And how can we overcome these barriers in order to get out of this situation? And at the same time, just to complement that, this lack of support for this measure, and the trade unions of journalists were in favour of the proposal.
Do you want to like really briefly respond to that?
Yeah, it's such a complicated question. I nearly wish you had asked something about fake news, but if you don't mind, I will discuss that with you during the break. It's some very complex issues are raised there.
Thank you very much, Theo. Maybe that's a good occasion then, because it would be great if you all join us and stay here later on. But I'm afraid we will have to leave this room soon, and I want to, of course, give the floor just for a very short moment again to PDLI and ECPMF to say some final words. I have to say that Pablo Soto, who was supposed to be here now, couldn't come now in the end. So thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you very much, Tarlach. And Virginia and Lutz are already here.
This is the microphone. Hopefully it works. Nothing can stop us. Not the problem with the microphone, not the problem with the heating system, not the problem with some power slides. Well, I have to cut it short because we have to really leave the room soon. I just want to remind you of two sentences. One is from Ricardo. He said, journalism is a public good. And the other sentence was here from the audience. A gentleman said, well, journalism, we have to make, he said on journalism, we have to make good journalism. And I want to add, we have to make good journalism possible. This is one reason, or the main reason for this conference, and this is why we struggle. What is left is just, I hope that in 1 year or maybe in 2 years we have a standardized model that is monitoring media ownership in all its complexity all over the world and also in Europe. Maybe we see that on the next NEWSOCRACY conference, or maybe a NEWSOCRACY conference 2 or 3 years ahead. This might be one goal that we take with us from this conference. And what is left to me is just to say thank you also on behalf of the PDLI. I have to say thank you to the speakers, to the moderators. Also, thank you for the translation and for the interpreters up there. Did really a brilliant job. Thank you to the staff of PDLI and to the staff of ECPMF, especially Nora and Yolanda. And thank you for cooking. I mean, the food was really well, excellent. So I hope we will be back one day, and I will pass the mic now to Virginia.
Thank you, Lutz. Well, I'll say my words in Spanish better, okay? Bueno,
Thank you all very much indeed for having been here. It's been an excellent experience, and in Spain there is very little discussion of these topics. People talk about it more abroad, but not in Spain. So it's good that we've been able to break with those opaque dynamics and bring some subjects to the light of day is a fundamental step forward. I would keep a lot of things in mind, but there's one thing that I'm going to remember henceforth, and that's the question of the transparency we have in Spain. It was the Director of Communication of the CNMT, the National Commission for Competition and Markets, and she said that the only point that the IBEX companies didn't agree on was their unwillingness to disclose their investments in the media. I think we should all remember that, because that's the starting point to continue to work to achieve that transparency, which will help to make all of us freer and our democracy stronger, as well as asking our citizens to demand that transparency with regard to media ownership and the interest that ownership of media entails. Because only by knowing that will the citizens be aware of what kind of information they are accessing. So, for me, NEWSOCRACY has been a wonderful challenge for the PDLI. It's been a wonderful opportunity, and we take this as the starting point of many, many other events. So we look forward to seeing you all again at future events, and thank you all very much once more.